Welcome, students. Let's just dive right in. For today's explainer, we are going to explore the massive pendulum swing in American politics, going all the way from the radical left movements of the 1960s right up to the conservative revolution of 1980. We're looking at a fascinating, chaotic 12-year window that literally rewired the American political landscape. And honestly, to understand where our politics are today, we absolutely have to understand how we navigated this critical era.
Here is our syllabus for today. We'll be covering the roots of the cultural divide, Nixon's paradoxical presidency, Watergate and broken trust, the 1970s economic malaise, the rise of the religious right, and finally, the 1980 conservative realignment.
All right, Section 1, Roots of the Cultural Divide.
We really have to start our timeline in the late 1960s, a period where America was deeply fractured by a massive generational divide. You know, that comfortable post-World War II consensus was just completely shattering. Young people in the counterculture movement were fundamentally rejecting the social norms of their parents' generation. And this terrified older Americans who valued traditional order. It was like a giant earthquake hit the traditional American way of life, and this massive culture shock sparked a lasting conservative backlash, giving Richard Nixon the perfect opening to appeal to what he famously called the silent majority in 1968.
Now, concurrently, marginalized groups across the spectrum were actively demanding new rights and freedoms. Women organized through the National Organization for Women. The Stonewall Inn riot essentially catalyzed the gay liberation movement, and Native American activists boldly occupied Alcatraz. For those demanding equality, it was this thrilling awakening. But as changing social norms fueled deep divisions across American generations, for those resistant to rapid change, it really felt like the traditional fabric of America was unraveling right before their eyes.
Moving on to Section 2, Nixon's paradoxical presidency. Okay, so what's genuinely wild about Richard Nixon's administration is this fascinating duality. Surprisingly, it was a Republican president who created massive liberal regulatory bodies like the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA, and he signed Title IX. Yet politically, he was actively cementing a new conservative base by utilizing a Southern strategy, basically appealing to white voters in the South by intentionally slowing down federal desegregation efforts. It's an incredibly stark contrast between Nixon-era domestic reforms and the emergence of new hardline conservative priorities.
Looking globally, Nixon drastically altered world power dynamics. In 1972, he stunned the entire globe with his historic opening to communist China. That completely changed global power dynamics, ending decades of isolation. Shortly after, he reached the absolute peak of détente, a relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union, by signing the SALT I nuclear treaty. But this diplomatic mastery abroad was a jarring contrast to the domestic chaos at home, whereas expansion of the Vietnam War had triggered explosive anti-war protests, tragically culminating in the deaths of 4 students at Kent State University.
Which brings us to Section 3, Watergate and broken trust.
So the narrative takes a really dark turn here with the defining scandal of the decade. It all started as this bungled break-in at the Democratic headquarters in '72, but the cover-up is what doomed the administration. When Nixon fired the independent special prosecutor during the infamous Saturday Night Massacre, the public realized the rot went all the way to the Oval Office. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon did what no president had ever done: he resigned. Actually, it wasn't just a political scandal. This sequence of events fundamentally altered and shattered the American public's trust in government institutions.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, the 1970s economic malaise.
Compounding the massive political crisis of Watergate was an incredibly painful era for the average working family. The post-war economic boom just died, replaced by a new word: stagflation. What does this actually mean for the everyday worker? Well, usually if unemployment is high, inflation is low. But in the 70s, Americans got hit with both simultaneously. Prices were skyrocketing while jobs were disappearing. This miserable nightmare economic reality severely undermined support for incumbent leaders like Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, making voters desperate for a totally new approach.
The shocks just kept coming. Nixon ending the gold standard in 1971 completely destabilized global currencies, which brought significant economic uncertainty straight to the American consumer. But the real gut punch? The 1979 energy crisis. Imagine waiting in line for hours just to get gas. Skyrocketing fuel prices fundamentally changed daily American life and severely crippled industrial productivity. And just when people thought it couldn't get worse, the partial meltdown at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in '79 absolutely terrified the nation.
Okay, Section 5,
Rise of the religious right.
As the economy faltered, social issues really took center stage, sparking a fierce clash over changing norms. The 1973 Roe v. Wade decision fundamentally altered the legal landscape, intensely galvanizing and intensifying religious political activism. Concurrently, conservative activists, most notably Phyllis Schlafly, launched the Stop ERA campaign. They argued that the Equal Rights Amendment and Title IX threatened the traditional family structure, essentially redefining the entire cultural conversation around women's roles in society.
All of this activist outrage over the era's social changes directly fueled the creation of the Moral Majority in 1979. Founded by Reverend Jerry Falwell, this organization successfully connected grassroots religious frustration to national politics. They effectively mobilized millions of voters against the changing tides, proving the religious right was no longer just some fringe cultural faction. No, they were a political juggernaut ready to flex their power at the ballot box.
And finally, Section 6, the 1980 Conservative Realignment.
We've now arrived at the climax of our timeline, where international embarrassment and domestic exhaustion collide head-on. Jimmy Carter's early foreign policy triumphs, like brokering the historic Camp David Accords, were just completely overshadowed by a cascading series of disasters in 1979. By the summer, the energy crisis led to his infamous crisis of confidence speech. Then, in rapid succession, the Iran hostage crisis began, and the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. The administration just looked completely powerless.
To put this in perspective, think about how quickly the relatively peaceful era of détente completely shattered. We went from the high-water mark of Nixon signing treaties with the Soviets in '72 straight into a renewed deep freeze. Following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Carter halted grain exports and initiated a U.S. boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, definitively ending détente and bringing the Cold War back to a freezing point.
444. I want you to really let that number sink in. This is the staggering number of days that 52 Americans were held captive in Tehran during the Iran hostage crisis. Night after night, the crisis played out on the evening news, completely paralyzing the Carter administration. It became a daily, painful symbol of American impotence and deeply humiliated the nation on the global stage. This single ongoing event fatally damaged Carter's re-election chances and proved to be a massive, unavoidable factor in the 1980 election outcome.
Exhausted by double-digit inflation, global embarrassment, and a decade of intense social upheaval, voters overwhelmingly chose Ronald Reagan. He promised a return to traditional values, a stronger military, and a booming economy. That massive generational divide that had opened up between 1968 and 1980, it had fundamentally altered American voting behavior. The New Deal liberal coalition that had dominated for decades finally fractured, giving way to a brand new era of conservative dominance. As we wrap up this lecture, I want to leave you with a crucial question to think about. How did a decade of economic instability, broken institutional trust, and rapid social change permanently rewire the American political pendulum? Because understanding this chaotic 12-year realignment, from the radical protests of 1968 to the conservative landslide of 1980, is the absolute key to understanding the bedrock of modern American politics. Thank you for joining me, and keep exploring the incredible cause and effect of history.